STI stigma is one of the greatest barriers to testing and knowing your status, as well as receiving treatment. Hi, I'm Samantha Bitty, sexual health and consent educator and anti-overly sensitive gag reflex activist. Today's lesson is in social studies. We are going to be discussing STI stigma. Pop quiz, true or false? Only men who have sex with men are at risk for HIV. False. HIV is like any other STI in that it is not located specifically in any one demographic of people. True or false? Getting an HPV vaccine means that you are protected against contracting HPV. The answer is false. HPV vaccines protect you against the most commonly occurring strains of the virus and/or the strains of the virus that have the most serious negative health outcomes. You can still totally get any of the next hundreds of HPV, and you can get different strains of HPV at the same time. True or false? STI testing is the same as Pap testing. The answer is false. STI testing checks for sexually transmitted infections, and Pap testing checks the cells on the cervix. True or false? Everyone who tests or is positive for an STI feels bad about it. The answer is false. Sometimes people test positive for an STI and it's curable. Sometimes they test positive for an STI and it is a forever thing. And either way, not everybody feels bad about that. How did talking about STIs make you feel? I mean, many aspects of sex are stigmatized, whether that's our physical health stuff or our desires. STI stigma is the negative stereotypes, attitudes, beliefs, personal fears, and feelings that we have about STIs. That then translates into our behavior. Things like the language we use to discuss STIs. Think, I'm clean, or they're dirty. Or it can be our lack of comfort in discussing safer sex and testing status in general. This all can really be linked back to our problematic and oppressive structures like racism, capitalism, sexism, homophobia, informing our collective values about sex. And different sex stigmas try to define our worth as individuals based on where we reside at a lot of those intersections. An example of this would be the different types of sex work and their associated stereotypes, or even different levels of so-called acceptability in mainstream society. In this lesson, we're focusing on STI stigma because I think that this landscape is the best illustration of the links between physical, mental, and relational health and how that plays out socially. The ramifications of STI stigma, which can range from self-judgment to shaming others to intimate partner violence, tend to actually be far worse than the negative physical health outcomes of detected and treated STIs. The irony being that STI stigma is one of the greatest barriers to testing and knowing your status, as well as receiving treatment. For example, if we fear being sex shamed by a doctor or a partner, we're not as likely to get tested. In social studies, we observe, compare, and contrast to draw valid conclusions about the area we are exploring. As an aside, exploring our own areas is STI Detection 101. I know I said valid. That doesn't mean that our feelings or those dangers don't exist. I just want us to see if we can assess if they're proportionate. Like if we're positive for specific STIs, how do we feel about that and how likely are we to tell somebody? There is, at best, messy logic, and at worst, systemic oppression at the root of how we assign stigma to particular infections. That can be the capitalistic origins of herpes stigma, fairly common, fairly innocuous STI that gained negative press in the mid-20th century with the advent and marketing of herpes management medication, Or it can be the homophobic and misguided mishandling of the HIV/AIDS pandemic by the media and medical community alike that renders HIV as the most highly stigmatized STI and even punishable by law for a lack of disclosure. Meanwhile, super chill, chlamydia and syphilis, if left untreated, can cause really serious negative health outcomes like pelvic inflammatory disease and even dementia. What you need to know is that STIs are part of sex. Risk is part of sex, the same way that risk is part of life. There are choices we can make to negotiate those risks. The most effective method of preventing the transmission of STIs is communication. Communication with your partners, communication with your healthcare providers, and communication with your own body. What I hope you will take away from this lesson is the desire to self-reflect on the internalized negative STI stigma you might have. Challenging these assumptions can empower you to communicate more confidently, whether that's with partners making informed decisions about the types of sex you have, or more honestly with healthcare providers to receive effective testing. And ultimately to just have better, safer, more pleasurable sex. Be sure to check out your homework on slice.ca.